All right, well, good morning. It's me again, Mr. Scott. Hope everyone is doing all right. I hope you had a good week. And I'm going to teach you some more SAT strategies, specifically about the writing and language section of the test. The writing and language section is a lot simpler than the reading comprehension. There are, if you recall, like with reading comp, there were all these steps that we'll go through again. We're reading the blurb, we're sandwiching the passage. With writing a language, a lot of it's very plug and play. I'm gonna pull up actually what the writing and language portion of the test looks like, in case you don't know what I'm talking about. Be in SAT practice test 9, scrolling through our reading comp, till eventually we get to the second portion of the test, yes, which is writing and language. Now, the first thing you might notice, this is the only portion of the test that has fewer minutes than questions allowed. So you're going to be spending on average less than a minute per question on a lot of these. The good news is that they're a lot more straightforward. So let me pull up those basic strategies we have for writing and language. Again, remember how reading comp, these reading passages took up like 4 or 5 slides? This is the only writing and language slide. This is everything you'll need to know. Really, all you're going to have to do is start from the beginning of the passage, exactly what we tell you to not do in reading comp. But in writing and language, you can really just start from the beginning and answer the questions more or less in order. What we usually recommend you do is you skim the answer choices to categorize the type of question. Now, the reason will become clear, but essentially, when you're doing a writing and language passage, you're reading the passage, everything's going fine, and then all of a sudden you come along a little portion that's underlined. It might have something wrong with it. Now, what we recommend, rather than you freak out about what might be wrong with it, you try to find what might be wrong with it, we recommend you first look at the answer choices allotted to see what you're even being tested on. Because you might be asking yourself, oh my goodness, is this the right word here? And the word is the same in all of your answer choices, and you're actually being tested on the commas. Once you know what you're being tested on, at that point, you can do what we always want you to do, and that's developing your own answer. And at that point, you can move into your process of elimination. You evaluate between the answers. A lot of them just have to do with what sounds right. If you've done a lot of reading, you will be at an advantage just knowing how words generally behave and how they flow into one another and where a comma usually goes and where it usually doesn't. If you don't do a lot of reading or that kinds of things make you nervous, there's just 2 things I want to say. Like, one, that's okay. You're not going to be tested in grammar in terms of extremely obscure grammar rules. What I mean by that is this. I think when a lot of us think about grammar, we think about rules no one cares about. And right? Like rules that just like they definitely apply in theory, but they really only matter in an English class. When in reality, basic grammar is what makes communication possible. And when the grammar is wrong in a sentence, if you speak English as your first language, and even if you don't, you're going to sense that something is off. So first I'll say that, like, you're using grammar every day, whether you realize it or not. The other thing you should be encouraged by is this. The SAT is not going to test you on those kinds of obscure grammar rules that I was just talking about. There are like obscure texts out there, known rules known only to grammarians with strange and obscure histories. That's not what the SAT is going to test you on. The SAT will test you on a few rules, and you have to know those rules really, really well. So again, fairly straightforward here on page 442. The title gives us some idea of what we're about to get into, but unlike with reading comp, we don't have a blurb. We don't have like a summary at all. We're kind of just diving in. So the title of this is Survival in the Hostile Environment of NW Rota 1. Well, I don't know what any of that means, but that's all right. We're gonna just tally forth. So you may see the first thing are these brackets before each sentence. This usually means that you're going to be asked a question about sentence order. And you'll be asked about like sentence number 4 and sentence number 5. Should this idea go between this one or that one? It's not anything we have to worry about yet, but it is something we shouldn't freak out about. If any of the sentences sound a little bit out of order, that's why. It's because you're going to be tested on it. So 60 miles north of Guam and more than 1,700 feet under the ocean's surface is the summit of NW Rota 1, an undersea volcano discovered in 2003. Surprisingly, the volcano appears to have been continuously active. It even grew 130 feet high, or in height, between 2006 and 2009. Yet, despite the hostile environment created by the constant volcanic activity, life is thriving there. Special adaptations are the key to survival. Okay, so we have a pretty good idea of what this passage is about, right? At that depth, water pressure suppresses the explosive force of the volcano's eruptions, allowing scientists to watch and observe them up close via remotely operated vehicles. Okay. So right here at number 5, or rather number 1, we're being given the phrase watch and observe. Now, before I freak out about what might be wrong about that, I'm just gonna pop on over here. And it looks like we're being tested on word choice. One which just has the opportunity for watch, one which has the option observe to see, and one which has visually watch. So I'm going to bring up an idea here of the basic categories of these questions. So if you ever need a shorthand for what it is you're going to be tested on, the writing and language is going to basically test you on if the passage follows 3 C's. You want the passage to be as clear as possible. And that means that it follows those basic grammar rules, right? If something is confusing or doesn't really work there, it's out of place. Those are like questions about flow. You'll be asked if the passage is consistent. So that means, you know, if I used a singular verb over here, does that match the noun that I had previously in the sentence? We should have that sort of straightforward consistency, no record scratches being thrown at us, right? And the last one, and which is usually the easiest to spot, but it can trip a lot of people up, is you want the passage to be as concise as possible. Now, if you don't know what concise means, that just means as short as you can make it. So a lot of us, when we're writing for school, we use more words than we need, right? We're trying to kind of buff up that word count, make it look more impressive. That's not actually good writing. Good writing says as much as it can with as few words as possible. So if we have any words that are repeated or words back to back that basically mean the same thing, that means our passage is not as concise as it could be. Now, those three C's are very basic categories, right? You could obviously get into it and, well, you know, you'll have your comma questions, you'll have your subject and verb agreement questions. But essentially, they are going to fall into these three. So if we go back to what we're looking at right now, it looks like I'm being given different word choice options. And when I think of watch and observe, those words actually mean pretty close to the same thing. So I have a lot of redundancy here. It's not as concise as it could be. Now, observe to see, that's just as repetitive, because seeing means observing. To visually watch, well, how else would you watch something? You can't watch things with your ears or any other sense. If you can say it with fewer words, that's always the option you want to go with. And again, you're going to do all that in less than a minute, okay? It's taking me a little longer just because I'm explaining my steps, but on test day, you're going to breeze through these. Now we come on to question 2, and it's the question that has to do with those bracketed sentences. And it says, to make the paragraph most logical, sentence 5 should be placed where? Well, let's look at sentence 5. At that depth, water pressure suppresses the explosive force of the volcano's eruptions, allowing scientists to watch and observe them up close via remotely operated vehicles. Well, the thing about, we're being asked about flow here. Where does this sentence go in the paragraph? And here's something I want to teach you about flow. And again, I can't teach you all of, middle and high school grammar, but I can remind you of some rules that you kind of already know. All sentences in a well-written paragraph, a sentence should have hooks in it. It should connect in some way to the sentence that comes before it, and in another way to the sentence that comes after it. So a well-written sentence is never just a list of like this, and this, and this. A well-written paragraph will go this, therefore this, because of this, as I said previously. Those are the kinds of hooks that I'm talking about. It has to connect in some way to the sentence before and the sentence after. Right, at the beginning of this passage, or at this sentence rather, we have a hook. It says, at that depth. It ends with a reference to depth, or it begins with a reference to depth, and it ends with a reference to these vehicles. So we want to put it somewhere directly following a description of depth. And the only place I see a description of depth will be here. Sentence 1, 1,700 feet under the ocean's surface. Now, the downside of that is that sentence number 2 doesn't really have any sort of reference to remotely operated vehicles, but that's okay. It still flows pretty well. So I'm going to say after sentence 1 is where sentence 5 should go. NW Rota 1, we just keep reading, is far below the ocean's photic zone where sunlight drives photosynthesis, semicolon. Nevertheless, comma, bacteria supporting a unique food web have adapted to this perpetually dark environment. Well, that nevertheless, that's a transition word, right? And we're going to go into all these sort of grammar ins and outs together. but nevertheless is transitioning by a way of contrast. Bacteria supporting a unique food web have adapted to this perpetually dark environment. Should that contrast this idea if we're using the word nevertheless? And as you can see, the choices we're being given in option 3 are all with different transition phrases that we could use. And yeah, for me, I see that connection really strongly. So they're far beneath where sunlight could reach. However, they have adapted to this perpetually dark environment. The plants are still doing well, right? So that's what would lead me to A in number 3. Any questions so far? Is that making sense? After that, we're just gonna continue to read through the passage. The bacteria have evolved to use hydrogen sulfide instead of sunlight for the energy that drives their metabolic processes, and hydrothermal venting is the source of the chemical soup necessary to support him or her. Well, if we look at the options on number 4, it seems like we're being tested on pronouns. So what should him or her connect to? What's the actual subject of this sentence? Necessary to support what? To support the bacteria. Well, bacteria doesn't really have gender, and it's also plural. Him or her is being used in a singular, gender-specific way. So I don't like A. The bacteria have evolved to use hydrogen sulfide. Now, it would be tempting because we definitely think of bacteria as an it, but bacteria is actually a plural noun, as we see here. Bacteria have evolved, not bacteria. Bacteria have evolved, not the bacteria has evolved. The name for one bacteria, by the way, is bacterium. You don't have to know that. You really just have to look at the clues here to know that we're dealing with something plural. And the only plural, gender-neutral pronoun here is them. Seawater seeping into fissures in the ocean floor is heated by underlying magma, and the heat drives chemical reactions that remove oxygen sulfates and remove other chemicals from the water. Number 5 is giving us some sort of verb tense options to replace and remove with it also removes and also removing. Or we could just use the word and. Now remember that rule of thumb. If we can use fewer words, we want to use fewer words. And notice we already use the word remove back here. So remove oxygen sulfates and other chemicals. Yeah, that works. We don't need to say remove twice. Well, I'm going to stop right there because I think you guys basically get it. That is writing in language. We'll go over some specific things that you'll be tested about later on in our teaching, but that is essentially how you want to walk through. You start from the beginning and you plug and play. Some of those, as you saw, were more like they were more like proofreader questions. Those questions that have a very clear right or wrong grammatical answer, right? Some of those were more like editor questions. We're saying there's nothing grammatically wrong here. There's nothing that would show up on spell check, if you want to think of it that way. But there's something that is off, potentially, about this paragraph. And it's up to you to discover it.